Chapter 7. Forged in Fire. Ilara stared out the window, the silhouettes of Phandalin houses visible at dusk. His hands clenched the hilt of his sword.
I see them again,
he murmured, his voice barely audible.
Ilara,
Zyra's voice softened as she stepped closer.
We need you. The people of Phandalin need you.
He turned, his gaze shadowed.
Need me for what? Another massacre?
To free Myrna and protect the town,
she countered.
There's a difference.
The flickering lanterns at the Stone Hill Inn cast dancing shadows across the worn wooden walls. A low hum of chatter hung in the air, buzzed with tension. In one corner of the common room, Doreen swirled a half-finished glass of wine. The rogue's foot tapped a restless rhythm on the floor, her sharp eyes darting among the patrons. She was clearly on edge. Too many delays, too little action. Nearby, Halia Thornton, head of the Miners' Exchange, approached with a cautious glance. She took a seat beside Doreen, speaking in a hushed voice meant only for her ears.
You look tense,
Halia said softly, a slight smile tugging at her lips.
Perhaps I can offer a proposition that might ease your frustrations.
Doreen returned a crooked grin.
If this proposition involves ridding Phandalin of these Red Brand dogs, and I suspect it does, then I'm listening.
Halia inclined her head.
Rumor has it you'll be confronting Glasstaff soon. If you ensure he never sees the inside of a prison cell, well, let's just say there's 100 gold pieces in it for you.
Doreen took a measured sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving Halia's.
I can make that happen one way or another. But what's in it for you?
Halia replied, her voice still low.
A more pliable group of Red Brands would allow certain business ventures to go smoothly. If you happen to seize control of any survivors, you'd find a friend in the Miners' Exchange. With power comes gold.
Doreen arched an eyebrow.
You're in luck. I just resigned from the Lord's Alliance,
she said in a sardonic tone.
And I know exactly how to keep loose ends tied up. Or cut short.
Their conversation was interrupted by movement from the stairs. Zyra descended with Ilara, her usual confident stride somewhat stiff. She wore a high-collared dress with long sleeves despite the warm evening, the fabric carefully arranged to cover every inch of skin below her neck. From the back of the common room, Morthal guided a slightly stumbling Balin toward Doreen's table. The two pairs met at the end of the chairs, creating an awkward bottleneck. Zyra pulled her sleeves tighter, pressing herself against the nearest chair to avoid contact as Morthal tried to maneuver the unstable dwarf past her. Their eyes met briefly before both quickly looked away, the tension from their earlier encounter hanging thick in the air.
Pardon,
Morthal mumbled, his eyes firmly fixed on the floor as he guided Balin to an empty seat. Zyra merely nodded, her jaw tight while Doreen observed the interaction with quiet curiosity. Without a further word, Halia stood and, with a graceful bow to Doreen, slipped out the inn's door. Morthal, determined not to lose momentum, called the party together around a broad table near the hearth. His voice was strained with worry, but resolve burned in his eyes.
We strike tonight,
he declared.
If we delay any longer, the Red Brands might move the prisoners. Or fortify. We can't let Myrna and her children suffer a moment more.
Zyra nodded, though her shoulders were tense. She kept a careful distance from Morthal, refusing to meet his eye. Balin mumbled something about the taste of ale still fresh on his tongue. Doreen nodded and started rummaging through her backpack at the table, pulling out various items and setting them aside.
Can't move quick enough with all this weight,
she muttered, discarding a bedroll, extra rations, and finally a coil of sturdy rope. Morthal noticed the rope and paused.
That might come in handy. For securing captives,
he said, reaching for it. Doreen's hand stopped his, and she gave him a wide smile.
If things go well, we won't need to tie anyone up.
Her tone was light, but something flickered behind her eyes that made Morthal's hand hesitate over the rope. Before Morthal could object, two young boys approached, eyes wide with excitement. One of them, Pip Stonehill, nudged his halfling friend, Carp Alderleaf, forward.
Tell them what you saw, Carp,
Pip urged. Carp shuffled his feet.
Saw red brands in the forest. They came out of a tunnel, a secret tunnel. If you go that way, you can sneak into Tressendar Manor.
Zira's tense demeanor softened into a genuine smile. She knelt down to their level, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone.
That's exactly the kind of sharp observation that makes a great adventurer. Keep your eyes open like that, both of you, and someday you might be leading your own party.
The boys stood a little straighter, beaming with pride at being treated like real adventurers rather than just children. With a nod to the others, Zira added,
Let's go. Ilara, will you lead us?
They found the tunnel precisely where Carp described. Ilara knelt by the entrance, tracing faint footprints with a gloved finger.
No more than a day old,
He muttered, voice strained. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the darkness. The passage was tight, forcing them to walk a single file, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. Doreen and Morthal followed Ilara to the darkness. Zira, illuminated slightly by the dull glow of conjured arcane light, crept behind Morthal. She flinched when the narrow walls forced her closer to Morthal, who was similarly tense. Balin followed, muttering curses under his breath each time he tripped on a loose rock. From ahead, Ilara's footsteps echoed into silence as he entered a larger cavern, dimly lit by distant torchlight. He paused, straining to hear anything beyond the steady drip of underground water. Without warning, an oily voice slithered into his mind, each word dripping with malice.
It's not your fault. Not your fault. I am so hungry.
Ilara clutched his head, his eyes growing wild and unfocused.
I hear them. Their screams, they won't stop.
His own scream tore through the cavern's silence.
Death!
The agonized cry echoed back to where the others waited. They exchanged alarmed glances before Zira whirled on Morthal, her eyes flashing.
He needs you. What are you waiting for?
She hissed. The group surged forward, following the sounds of Ilara's madness. Morthal took the lead, his heavy armor clanking as he veered into a narrow side passage where echoing footsteps betrayed Ilara's path. Doreen moved like a shadow behind him, while Zira and Balin brought up the rear, their boots scuffing against the rough stone floor. Rounding a sharp bend in the tunnel, they saw an open door spilling torchlight into the passage. Beyond it, Ilara was already locked in combat with 4 red brands, his blades flashing in a deadly dance, as his battle cry reverberated off the stone walls.
Helm, guide our blades.
Morthal's battle cry echoed as he charged into the fray, but their momentum faltered as a mountain of a man, wielding a pitted greatsword, filled the doorway. His bulk created an effective barrier, trapping Doreen, Zira, and Balin in the tunnel. Doreen's rapier would be useless against such a brute, so she melted back into the shadows. Zira stepped forward, her breath catching.
Doreen, make your shots count.
Inside, Ilara moved like a deadly wind, his blades finding their mark as one red brand crumpled. Simultaneously, Morthal's warhammer connected with a sickening crunch against the doorway defender, followed by Doreen's arrow burying deep in the man's thigh. But rather than falling, the brute's face contorted with rage. He spat a string of vicious curses and brought his blade down on Morthal with renewed fury. Then came the sound that turned their blood to ice, hinges creaking behind them. Zira and Balin spun to face a previously hidden door, now revealing 3 enormous bugbears. The creatures' yellowed fangs gleamed in the torchlight as they advanced on the trapped adventurers. Their leader, a towering mass of matted fur and muscle, bared yellow fangs in a feral grin that promised violence. Intelligence glittered in his dark eyes. These weren't mindless beasts, but cunning predators. With a bone-chilling roar, the bugbears surged forward, their massive weapons cutting through the confined space of the tunnel. The narrow corridor became a death trap. Zira and Doreen found themselves caught in a lethal vice, red brands pressing from the room ahead, while the bugbear's bulk filled the passage behind them. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of blood and the musty stench of the creature's fur. Despite his drunken state, Balin moved with unexpected grace. His glaive swept in a deadly arc, opening a ragged gash across the lead bugbear's chest. The creature's roar of pain was drowned out by Zyra's incantation. Her hands, steady despite her racing heart, wove patterns in the air before unleashing a torrent of flames. The inferno filled the corridor, turning it into a furnace. The bugbears only emerged from the flames with singed fur and eyes burning with murderous rage.
The path is clear.
Morthal's voice boomed over the chaos as he finished the wounded Redbrand with a decisive blow.
Elara, stand with me. We must clear this room or we are caught in the crossfire.
His words carried both command and desperate hope as the battle raged around them. The bugbear's rage found a focus in Zyra, their fur still smoking from her flames. From the back ranks, one of the creatures bared its fangs in a cruel smile and launched a spear that whistled past her ear, close enough that she felt the wind of its passage. Their leader seized this moment to strike. Zyra backpedaled in the cramped hallway, her shoulders scraping stone walls. Time seemed to slow as the leader's spiked mace descended toward her skull. Drawing on her last reserves, she conjured a shield of pure magic, a gossamer thin barrier that caught the crushing blow. The impact sent shockwaves through her arms, and her arcane defense exploded into glittering shards. Desperate, she gathered her power for another spell. Fire erupted from her trembling hands, but this time the flames lacked their previous intensity. The bugbears pushed through the weakened inferno, their weapons cutting dark arcs through the dying light. As Zira turned to flee, the leader's mace found its mark. The spiked head tore through her robes and into flesh, sending white-hot agony racing along her spine. Her scream echoed off the stone as she pitched forward, blood spreading across her back in a warm rush. Fighting through waves of pain, she crawled toward the room's entrance, each movement leaving a crimson trail behind her. With Zira crawling to safety, Doreen stepped into the breach. Her rapier glinted in the torchlight as she planted her feet in a perfect fencing stance, positioning herself between the wounded sorceress and the advancing monsters.
"You'll not take another step,"
she declared, her voice steady despite her racing heart. But before she could execute her planned strike, another spear whistled through the air from the rear bugbear. The weapon found its mark, driving deep into her abdomen. Doreen gasped, the taste of copper filling her mouth. She tried to maintain her stance, but her rapier's reach proved woefully inadequate against the towering beast before her. The bugbear leader's laugh rumbled like distant thunder as he brought his mace around in a devastating arc. The weapon caught Doreen squarely in the chest, the impact lifting her off her feet. She hit the stone wall with a sickening crack, her small frame crumpling to the floor like a discarded puppet. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth as consciousness fled, leaving her lying still and broken in the shadows. A bugbear loomed over her, vile breath rasping in her face as he bellowed a triumphant roar. Zira, bleeding heavily, yelled in desperation,
Morthal, they'll kill her! Do something!
Morthal abandoned his duel mid-swing, the cry of his fallen companion drowning out all tactical sense. Behind him, Ilara's twin blades found their mark with deadly precision, ending the Redbrand's life in a spray of crimson. But the victory was short-lived as Ilara swayed, his previous battle frenzy fading to reveal the toll of his wounds. The bugbear leader seized this moment, his mace describing a lethal arc toward Morthal's head. Divine intervention manifested as Morthal's holy symbol flared with brilliant light, deflecting the killing blow by mere inches. In that same chaotic instant, Zyra summoned her magic, desperate to aid her companions. Horror froze her heart as Ilara stumbled directly into her firebolt's path. The spell struck him square in the back, drawing an agonized scream from the already wounded elf. His twin blades clattered to the stone floor as flames licked across his leather armor. With a haunting cry that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken, Ilara staggered backward into the room, smoke still rising from his scorched armor.
Ilara! Gods, no!
Zyra's voice shattered, thick with guilt and terror, as she watched her friend collapse against the nearby wall. Steel rang against steel as Morthal engaged the bugbear leader in a brutal dance of survival. Each clash reverberated through the chamber, the cleric's arms trembling with the effort of turning aside the monster's crushing blows. Despite bleeding from multiple wounds, the bugbear fought with undiminished savagery. The deadlock broke only when Zira's magic, fueled by desperation and remorse, struck true at last. The arcane blast caught the leader full in the chest, the force lifting him off his feet. He crashed to the ground with a final guttural roar, massive form twitching once before falling still. An eerie silence descended as the bugbear chieftain fell. His two remaining warriors froze, their bestial faces contorted with a mixture of shock and vengeful rage. Their moment of hesitation was all Morthal needed. His prayer to Helm summoned healing light that wrapped around Doreen's broken form. She stirred with a weak cough, color slowly returning to her ashen face. Against the wall, Ilara pushed himself up with trembling arms, retrieving his fallen blades despite the angry burns across his back. He stumbled to Morthal's side, forming a ragged defensive line. Behind them, Zira forced herself to stand, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her lacerated back. Her hands shook as she gathered what remained of her magical energy. Doreen, still dazed, braced herself against the wall and nocked an arrow with unsteady fingers. The first bugbear charged with a thunderous roar, but met a devastating counterattack. Morthal's warhammer crashed down from above as Ilara's sword opened a crimson gash across its flank. Doreen's arrow found its mark between the creature's ribs, and Zyra's flames engulfed its massive frame. The beast thrashed once before crumpling to the ground, its fur smoldering. But its companion was already moving, driven mad with bloodlust. The creature's great axe swept in a savage arc, catching Ilara before anyone could react. The blade bit deep into his side, and the elf's face contorted in agony as fresh blood spilled from his lips. He collapsed to the stone floor with a sickening thud.
Morthal!
Zyra's terrified cry pierced the air.
He's dying! You must help him!
Morthal planted himself between the enraged bugbear and his fallen companion, every heartbeat an eternity. Doreen loosed another arrow, and the bugbear staggered. Zira, tears streaking her face, hurled a final firebolt that blasted into the beast's shoulder, scorching deep. With a strangled snarl, it collapsed, hitting the ground with a hefty thud. Silence settled over the room. The stench of burnt fur and fresh blood filled their lungs, and the flicker of Zira's spell light revealed the severity of their injuries. Morthal crashed to his knees beside Ilara, his armored hands slick with blood as he channeled Helm's healing light. The elf's eyes fluttered open as divine energy knitted torn flesh, though pain still lined his features. At last, each survivor lifted their gaze and looked around. Blood dripped from Morthal's gashed shoulder. One of Doreen's arms hung limp at her side. Zira clutched at her tattered dress in a futile attempt at modesty. She was crying silently, and pain etched into every line of her face. Ilara lay propped against a shattered table, breathing in labored rasps. Reality crashed over them like a cold wave as they surveyed the aftermath. Death had passed so close they could still feel its shadow. The room and the corridor had become a charnel house, where red brands and bugbears lay twisted in final repose. Doreen coughed bitterly, her eyes flashing with rage.
That coward Balin, I saw him slip away when the bugbears first appeared. He was on their other flank. Could have turned the tide, cut them down from behind.
She spat blood onto the stone floor.
Instead, he left us to die.
Zyra huddled against the wall, her voice barely above a whisper.
I truly thought that was the end.
Her eyes found Ilara's scorched back, and fresh tears welled up.
I'm so sorry, Ilara. Gods, I never meant—
Ilara managed a weak gesture that might have been forgiveness, though pain prevented more than a hoarse grunt. Morthal squeezed the elf's shoulder before rising to his feet, his gaze sweeping over his battered companions with fierce protectiveness. The weight of near failure pressed heavy on his shoulders. Silence descended, broken only by their labored breathing echoing through the manor's cold underground passages. The darkness ahead still held its secrets. Somewhere Myrna and her children awaited rescue. They had survived this bloodbath, though the cost was written in their wounds and exhaustion.
Hide my marked skin beneath these clothes. Yet dragon fire still burns and grows. Both gift and curse flow through my veins. Power that hurts, but still remains. Cannot hide scales, cannot tame flame. This cursed power bears my name. Yet in this fire, I'm who I am, both blessed and damned by dragon's brand. Friend's flesh burns now by my mistake. Power too wild for me to break. Yet without flames, I'm incomplete. This burning soul makes me unique. Every mirror shows what I despise. Every flame proves where strength lies. Caught between two opposing truths. Dragon's daughter, bearing proof. These spreading scales won't go away. This burning gift is here to stay. Though sometimes it brings friends to harm, it's still the strength within my arms. Some nights I wish these scales would fade. Some days I feel their powers aid. Perhaps I'm meant to walk between both cursed and blessed, half fire, half